Hello, good night. Today our guest is Sascha Becker. Hello, Sascha. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you, Lipton.
Yes, I'm great, Sascha. Sascha, you have been cited by so many people in your articles and books. And do you know why? Because you revisited the work of Max Weber. Was Max Weber right, Sascha?
I think Max Weber is right on many things he said and wrote about, and I'm a big fan of his work overall. I admire him. But when it comes to his Protestant ethic, I think a path-breaking work, really, at the intersection of economics and sociology and so on. It's not clear to me that a Protestant ethic, strictly interpreted as a set of behaviors that is different for Protestants compared to other types of Christians, that alone can explain differences in economic success. And instead, the work that I did many years ago with my colleague Ludger Bösmann says that an alternative explanation may be education differences, that Protestants put more emphasis on getting everyone to read the Bible and in extension get more education, that could be an alternative explanation for the same finding, namely that Protestants overall are economically more successful.
Yes.
So in that sense, there is a lot that I admire about Weber, but I'm not convinced that it's the ethic per se that explains differences in economic success.
Yes, this paper is titled Was Weber Wrong? A Human Capital Theory of Protestant Economic History, published in 2009. And you argue that we find that Protestantism indeed led to higher economic prosperity, but also to better education. Our results are consistent with Protestants' higher literacy accounting for most of the gap in economic prosperity. I have often argued that the benefits of Protestantism are actualized via the channel of individualism. Protestants emphasize the individual and reading and philosophy more broadly, and as such, Protestantism is correlated with development because of individualism. This is my opinion based on surveying the data.
Yeah, I mean, there is also work that says that individualism is another channel by which Protestantism may affect things. For sure, I'm not advocating a monocausal explanation that it's all and only about education. So the factor you mentioned is likely yet another one that varies across different religious denominations.
But what's quite compelling is that the Roman Catholic Church built eminent universities during the medieval ages, and many of the monasteries functioned as financial institutions. Some were even involved in manufacturing. So when people praise Protestantism, I don't get upset, but I often remind them that the Catholic Church during the medieval ages was not necessarily a laggard.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything is relative. What's the reference point? The Catholic Church has achieved many wonderful things, and it's one of the most long-lived institutions on the planet that has been around for centuries or even millennia. And I think there is also work out there by people praising various religious orders as also having instilled things into people that have fostered economic development, such as the work by Benson and Dalgard and co-authors on the Cistercian monks. So for sure, there is a lot of differences across even subgroups within Catholicism that have had various beneficial effects on economic development.
Exactly. I was just about to mention that paper, Pre-Reformation Roots of the Protestant Ethic. The paper
Exactly, yeah,
yes.
that's the one I'm referring to, yeah.
Because they valued work, both intellectual work and physical work, and that there's a correlation between some elements of Calvinism and medieval Roman Catholic thought, because the Calvinists view academic excellence as evidence as God's favor, and medieval monks also valued work and achievement. But though they valued work, they were less invested in projecting social achievements.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. No, I like that paper a lot, but also what it points out is, since it focuses on Cistercians and at a period before the Reformation, that is then again in comparison to the rest of Catholicism. So it also says implicitly that other parts of the Catholic Church, other orders, or the church overall outside the monastic world, are lagging behind the Cistercians on that. So it's not the Catholic Church overall, but that particular order has been highlighted in this work as standing out.
Exactly. Sashka, I am not an expert in medieval philosophy. I'm interested in the topic, but I'm not an expert. I don't know if you're an expert, but the Protestant Revolution, according to some scholars in the field, was a bit anti-rational. The medieval scholastics were really interested in the interplay between faith and religion and natural philosophy. But when I read people like Luther and Calvin, they sound faith-based and a bit mystical. So whenever people, when I was younger and the argument was elucidated that Protestantism led to science, I was confused until I read Peter Harrison. I don't think we give the medieval scholastics enough credit.
Yeah, I wouldn't call myself an expert on medieval philosophy, definitely not. But again, the broader theme that you're touching on is that for sure, the world didn't suddenly start in 1517, and before that it was darkness, but there are many precursors of Protestant thought. And what seems to have been the case is that there was, after 1517, a bit more emphasis. Also, parts of the pop previously weren't at the center of attention. So thinking just about the fact that Protestants also wanted girls to be able to read the Bible, so that the gender dimension is something that before didn't feature prominently in the Catholic Church.
Exactly. The Protestant Revolution was more democratic than Catholic philosophy, and this is one of the reasons why it appears to be advantageous, because it enabled ordinary people to think critically.
Yeah, I think that is something I would subscribe to. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but as I said earlier, I am not an expert in medieval philosophy, and you also admit to not being an expert. But Sashka, you're so right. Development did not start in 1500. Some of your colleagues are doing brilliant work on the medieval ages. This is a topic that is presently piquing my interest. The interplay between religion and development, and I'm really fascinated by the Roman Catholic Church, because the Roman Catholic Church basically created the rule of law in the West. So again, if we're going to talk about religion and Protestantism, we have to mention some of the Catholic rules of the Protestant work ethic.
Yeah, absolutely. No,
Yeah,
I agree with you that, as I said, it's not that Luther invented something out of thin air, but there were precursors, which also Max Weber himself highlighted, that the Cistercians feature also in his work. And that's why also Anderson and Benson and Dalgard pick up on that. Yeah.
Yeah, and what people often overlook again is that some of the earlier pre-Luther cults and even post-Luther cults, they were a bit socialistic.
Yeah.
Yes. So I like Max Weber. Max Weber is brilliant, but it is so nuanced, much more nuanced than Max Weber makes it appear.
Yes, but even Max Weber, I find, is very broad and nuanced in many respects, which also makes it hard to, so to say, test his work in a strict empirical sense. Yeah, because this paper that we've been talking about early on, the one that we titled "Was Weber Wrong?" also received quite some criticism from Weber scholars who said, you are misinterpreting him or you are misrepresenting him. And I think we are quite clear in our work that we say, well, we are testing something that some people have called the common interpretation of the Protestant ethic. So it's a short version that doesn't give credit to every single nuance of Max Weber's work. So in that sense, it is a piece of true classical scholarship that brings forward many arguments and weaves them together. Whereas I guess in the empirical social sciences these days, we often test one particular effect from A to B, because that's where causality can be talked about. But clearly the underlying work of Max Weber has a richness to it that also is hard to empirically confirm or disconfirm.
You're right about that, because even though Max Weber is not 100% accurate, there are studies asserting that in Protestant countries, people actually work for a longer duration of time.
Yeah, so clearly there is also work that tries to test or says, okay, isn't a Protestant work ethic ultimately measurable as work hours? Yeah? Some people have tested that and have looked at data on, well, the number of hours per week that Protestant people work versus Catholic people. There is also, that has been done for Germany, for instance. Other people have looked at Switzerland, where you also have Protestants and Catholics, and there you have Calvinists and Catholics. And in the German lands, it's mostly Lutherans and Catholics. And has found that in Swiss referenda, where there were votes on certain issues that would have an influence on number of holidays, and on work times, in Protestant areas, there was more openness towards more work and less holidays. So there is definitely also that. So my own work doesn't say that the work ethic is wrong outright, but that the education aspect has been overlooked. That is how I would summarize my own previous work.
Yes. But Sashka, why would Protestants be more inclined to work for a longer period of time?
Well, that is maybe more the classical Weber argument, that he refers to Luther's reference to a calling, die Berufung, which also has the same stem in the word Berufung of Beruf, the job, the occupation. And that, at least in the Calvinist strand of Protestantism, you may find a calling in life in a particular role, and you may then also be very eager to fulfill that role to its fullest, and that could also implicate you just spend more time working on something that you find fulfilling.
Do you know what I'm thinking about, Sashka? I'm thinking about the Americans. America has the most productive manufacturing workers in the world, and they value work. So the best case study of the Protestant work ethic, in my view, is America.
Yeah, I know much less about the US, I guess, than about Germany or some of the European countries. But yeah, that may well be the case. And also Weber's work refers to the Puritans and whatever then happened in the US in the last few hundred years. But I myself haven't studied that at all.
And it is evident in American pop culture. Americans, they will brag, I work 2 or 3 jobs. And the summer job is really popular in the United States. America globalized the notion of the summer job. By the time these children are 14, they're working. So I have observed this by consuming American pop culture.
Yeah, no, I think there is something to it. I mean, clearly on US visits, it's often visible also at universities. It is, for me as a visitor, even long-time visitor, people seem to be more busy and less inclined to just call it a day at 5 p.m. and go for a beer, which you might find in European countries, also here in Australia. People are more open to just also have fun in life. But yeah, I haven't studied that extensively and in an empirical way.
Yeah, neither have I, but there seems to be something special about the Americans. No, Sashka, earlier in the conversation, you briefly touched on girls and education, but I know that you have written papers on the link between Protestantism and female empowerment. Tell us a little about this line of research.
Yeah, so that is something probably in my own work on religion and economics. That was the first paper that was published in 2008, 1 year ahead of the Was Weber Wrong that we already talked about, even though the latter one was conceived before. But as we were reading more about Protestantism and education and so on, it struck us that Luther very explicitly talks about girls, and he said, and would to God that every town also had a girls' school so that they could read the gospel 1 hour each day. And we found that quite striking, considering in how many countries, even these days, girls wouldn't get the same support to attend school as boys do, just thinking of, say, the Taliban in Afghanistan these days and 500 years later. So we thought, wow, that's interesting and something we hadn't known before, reading about it. So we said, okay, let's look at whether we find a different education gap between boys and girls in Protestant areas relative to Catholic areas. And for that, we looked at school enrollment data, which we found for 1816 in Prussia, so one of the biggest states in the German Empire. And we did indeed find that the gap in enrollment rates between boys and girls was much smaller in Protestant areas than Catholic areas. And we found that not only at primary school level, where maybe it's about basic literacy, but also at secondary school level. And then we followed that up over the decades afterwards. So we also then found gender-specific literacy rates towards the end of the century, 1871, where again, the gap in literacy rates between boys and girls was smaller in Protestant areas and Catholic areas. And then even later on, there is then interesting data about enrollment in universities. So first, girls or women weren't allowed to even enroll in university until the beginning of the 20th century. But when they finally were allowed to, in the 1900s, early 1900s, then it turned out that among the female students in Prussian universities, the vast majority was Protestant and well in excess of the population share of Protestant women. So what we seem to see is that as the state then increasingly also intervened in the schooling sector, increasing and the age that up to which kids should stay in school, so compulsory schooling, that equated over time the enrollment rates. Obviously, if everyone has to go to school, boys and girls, by the state's order, at some point the education gap is gone at this kind of basic education, but the gap still persisted at secondary and tertiary education levels. And we then even went on to collect data on university enrollments in the 1950s and 60s after World War II in Germany, where still Catholic women had substantially lower enrollment rates than Protestant women. And that's something that back in those days was still a matter of debate, but that today people are no longer aware of, that there used to be these differences. But interestingly, and now moving away from the gender dimension again, in the Was Weber Wrong paper, we also looked at years of education in around the year 2000, using data from the German socioeconomic panel, so a household level data set, where Protestants, even nowadays in the year 2000, had higher education levels than Catholics. And all of that is things that nowadays go unnoticed, because in everyday conversations, it isn't a matter of discussion usually. Are you Catholic or are you Protestant? You just have some friends or colleagues at work. And unless you explicitly touch on religion and on do you go to church and these kinds of things, you wouldn't see this empirical regularity, because you're simply not aware whether your conversation partner, your colleague, your friend is Catholic or is Protestant. And then you wouldn't see these correlations, but in the data we were able to find them. So there is often these religious patterns or the correlations that also follow religious or denominational lines that people these days are not anymore fully aware of, and you need to study data to see them.
Brilliant. Sashka, I think that we're beginning to unlock the puzzle. Protestantism has an advantage over the Roman Catholic Church because it is less hierarchical, and hierarchies don't promote innovation and entrepreneurship. In Protestantism, there's an implicit assumption that we all have dignity. The Roman Catholic Church also shares this assumption, but the Protestant Church is more democratic. So it's easier for people to conceptualize ideas and to value their own beliefs within an intellectual space.
Yeah, let me generally agree on that. And the way Protestant churches are organized as organizations is they seem to have flatter hierarchies. Yeah? There is nothing like a pope. There is not the one center of power in the church, but it's as a church organized, it has a flatter hierarchy and more bottom-up participation. And in various dimensions, even today, only men can be ordained ministers in the Catholic Church. In the Protestant Church, it's also women. And all of that, as you phrase it, democratizes a religion to some extent. And that also affects the way people think about, say, the gender dimension in everyday life, but also about the role of hierarchy, belief in the authority of specific individuals like the Pope, or whether it's more the community of believers that has the same right to influence the way things go in the church.
Yes, and another advantage could be that gender equality is often indicative of innovation and people empowerment more broadly. So, a culture that values the labor of women as individuals is more likely to be successful. So, this could be another channel to which the benefits of Protestantism are actualized.
Yeah, I would agree to that. Yeah.
Yeah, so interesting debate on Protestantism. And Professor Becker, you also did another earlier paper arguing, it is titled The Effect of Protestantism on Education Before the Industrialization, Evidence from 1816. And you're arguing that Protestantism led to more schools and higher school enrollment before the industrialization. Tell us a little about this paper.
Yeah, so we wrote this paper explicitly as a follow-up on the Was Weber Wrong, because one comment we often received when presenting our argument about Protestantism and education and economic development as, so to say, a causal chain, that some people said, well, look, to the extent that you only look at data in that Was Weber Wrong paper, after the Industrial Revolution had started, it could well be the case that Max Weber was right and you are wrong, in the sense that Protestantism brought about capitalism, a Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, and Protestant areas industrialized before Catholic areas, and the demand of the new jobs in manufacturing, etc., on education were higher, so that industrialization triggered demand for education, and that we get, so to say, the causality chain wrong. Yeah? And that's why we thought it was crucial to show that even before industrialization started big time, we see differences in education between Protestant and Catholic areas. And that's why we deliberately try to find data before 1830, which many economic historians say is the year in which industrialization, or that decade when industrialization in the German lands took off. And then we found these school enrollment statistics in 1816 and found that indeed school enrollment rates in Protestant areas are substantially higher. And that seemed to give support to this idea. It's first an effect on education, and then from there to better economic outcomes.
Professor, do we have data on the relationship between Protestantism and innovation?
I believe there is some work by Francesco Cinirella that talks about patents, and again uses Prussian data, and this has some relationship there again between Protestantism and more patenting. Yeah, so there seems to be something going on there, at least in the German context.
What's really unusual about this line of research is that the evidence is favoring Protestantism in the arena of academic performance, but the Roman Catholic Church is known for creating excellent schools. So, for example, I live in Jamaica, and many of the prestigious schools were formed by the Roman Catholic Church, and it is also quite similar in the United States and other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in all that I talked about, I try to say again and again, Germany, Prussia, and so on. So that's the at least geographic areas I have worked on. So extrapolating that to a worldwide perspective isn't easy, not least because obviously if you think about, say, countries in Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, and so on, and then compare it to Portugal, Spain, Italy as Catholic countries. It's not just that the first set of countries is Protestant, the second set is Catholic, but these are also very different countries overall, different climatic conditions, proximity to the Mediterranean or proximity to the polar circle, blah, blah, blah. There are various reasons why different countries perform differently. And that's why an analysis in a restricted geographic area is more promising to really carve out what is the result of a specific denomination on economic outcomes. Now, for sure, people have found also very positive effect of Catholic presence in different countries. And the question is always, what's the counterfactual? What are we comparing it to? So is it, as you say, Jamaica, are we talking Catholic versus Protestant, or Catholic versus no Christian presence? Yeah? And that is always important to ask for every paper or piece of research. What is the counterfactual? What's the comparison group? And I think one finding from a more cross-sectional analyses often looks at missionaries and compares Protestant and Catholic missionaries in terms of their influence on local populations, which by no means is always positive. There's also many negative effects that the colonizers and the missionaries brought, but also there, often people find that Protestant missionaries had more beneficial effects on education outcomes than Catholic missionaries. But also point highlighted by many is that competition is also in itself beneficial. So that in areas where both Protestant and Catholic missionaries were active, that had overall more beneficial effect than if only one of the two groups is around, because they would compete head on and try to outperform each other.
Sascha, I'm familiar with the data of Protestantism in the developing world, but I do believe the issue is related to the colonial power. British colonies were more likely to encourage decentralized education. So in these colonies, the missionaries were encouraged to create a curriculum that suited the clientele at the time, whereas the French colonies, their policy was a bit more stringent and churches were restricted in what they could teach. So maybe this is just a selection effect.
Yeah, that's also quite possible. And I think on the research front, that has not been looked at in as much detail as one would hope. So I see personally a bit of a divide between, on the one hand, a literature that looks at colonialism and focuses mostly on state presence and state actors. And then there is the missionary literature that does as if there is no state around. And there is quite little work really that tries to look at also the interaction between the colonizers as the state actors or secular actors and the missionaries. And different countries also have very different histories in terms of who came first. Sometimes missionaries were active before the colonizers. Sometimes they arrived at the same time. Sometimes the colonizers came first, the missionaries later. And all of these things, I think, haven't been studied carefully enough yet. I know of very little work. There was one piece of work on Madagascar that does that pretty nicely, but it hasn't been done in a very systematic way. So what you pointed out, that the French, the Brits had very different approaches. Some people have done work now on Cameroon, which for some time
I read that paper
was
on
colonized by
Cameroon.
Germany and then was split up. And that gives you some view on what's the difference between French and British colonizers. But much more has to be done on that front.
Yes, the Cambridge Journal published a study on Cameroon, arguing that the British side of Cameroon is more successful. And again, we could be correct. French colonizers were a bit more aggressive in their ability to control what was taught. So maybe it's just a selection bias. British colonizers gave missionaries greater latitude to tailor programs to suit the needs of the natives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the interaction between state and church in third countries or in the colonial context is an area that is super fascinating, and lots still needs to be done. Also, myself, I'm currently doing some work with a PhD student of mine who's Korean on missionary presence in Korea. And what is fascinating there is that the colonizers in Korea were the Japanese, and the missionaries, by definition, are Christians. So there we have also a disconnect between the nationality of the missionary workers and the nationality of the colonizers. So it's a quite fascinating setting to look at the interaction between the two, because it's not the same national origin of the two groups. Whereas in Africa, typically, in British colonies, there were then also British missionaries. In French colonies, there were French missionaries, mostly.
And in developing countries, educated people were more likely to be religious because the churches promoted literacy. So this could be one reason why the secularization effect is so dominant in the Western world and is yet to be realized in the non-Western world. Christianity is booming in Latin America and Africa.
Yeah, that's quite possible. I mean, talking about secularization, and you talked earlier about the US and also the fact that in the US people love to work long hours, etc. First of all, the US is quite particular in having been populated over the last centuries by Europeans who may have been, according to many, the most ambitious people who somehow want to move up. And there is this whole upward mobility argument that the US is populated by a different type of individual than many European countries. But another point that's often made about the US in a religious context is that it is maybe the most competitive country also in terms of religious competition, so that there is an offering for every taste, so to say. If you want a church that does rock music and has still a very structured liturgy, probably there is something out there. If you don't like liturgy, you just want an amazing sermon and you want classical music, you will also find that. Yeah? And in that sense, churches in Europe are often very streamlined and very similar to each other. And that competition in the US also means that secularization hasn't kicked in as strongly yet as in many European countries, because the offerings by the various churches are just so rich that for those that in Europe would have already left the church, run away because it's all so boring and all the same, in the US can somehow find a niche where they are happy.
Again, the absence of a state church in America promoted competition. The existence of a state church fosters laziness. If the church is a monopoly, it is less likely to disseminate to disseminate information, because more than likely people are receptive to the monopoly. So over time, it becomes lazy.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's a
yes.
fair way to put things. Yeah.
Okay, so that this is a difference between the Americans and the Europeans. And furthermore, Europeans were never religious. Even during the medieval ages, paganism was popular. And the word pagan literally means a rural person. But many of these rural people, they worship different gods. So over time, we have described paganism as a religion. So Europeans were never overly religious, and today, the church is influence has waned somewhat, but people unfortunately conflate the influence of the church in building institutions with religiosity. But Europeans were never religious in the first place.
Yeah, so some people have put it that way. I would put it in a somewhat more nuanced way. So I think the fact that many researchers in this literature we talked about have overlooked, but that sociologists of religion have known for a long time, is that the spread of Christianity was by no means a big bang in the first millennium, but Christianity spread mostly in Southern Europe on the back of the Roman Empire. And north of the Limes, the dividing line between the Roman Empire and, say, the Germanic tribes and so on, Christianity didn't arrive until 500 to 1,000 years later. So, for instance, talking about the Baltic Sea, the kind of sea in the north east of the German lands, there is the biggest island of Germany today, Rügen, where Christianity only arrived in 1350, 1,000 years after it arrived in the south of Germany. And interestingly, that north-south divide also is, broadly speaking, the north-south divide in Protestant versus Catholic. So it's a bit this last in, first out. The areas of Germany that became Christian last were the ones where the Catholic Church never got as deeply rooted, and where Protestantism and Lutheranism found it easier to take over, because Christianity of the Catholic flavor never had such deep roots, and hence a new kid on the block, a new competitor, found it easier to take over.
Yeah, Sashka, have you ever considered doing a study on Christianity in Ethiopia?
No, not from an academic point of view. I am absolutely fascinated by the early Christian church, and I think that there is still amazingly little work on that. And just these days, it's funny that you mentioned that. I was looking at photos of Christian churches in Ethiopia, and I also took a big interest in recent weeks and months in Armenia, where also Christianity arrived quite early, and where Christianity is deeply rooted, and there are fascinating buildings that have survived for 1600 years. So yeah, no, I haven't really thought about writing a paper about it, but I so to say, take a leisurely interest in trying to understand early Christianity better. I think another area, as you mentioned, Ethiopia, and I then added Armenia, is I think we also in the Christian world know relatively little on the research side, at least among economists, my kind of tribe, on the Orthodox churches and the spread of Christianity increase on the back of ultimately the Apostle Paul, who traveled the Mediterranean. And I think we know very little about that compared to how much research there is on the Roman Catholic Church and on Protestantism.
Sashka, I was just about to mention the Orthodox Church, and what I'm about to say is quite crucial to your broader research. Orthodox Christianity is different from Protestant Christianity and the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church was receptive to Greco-Roman knowledge, so it is not a surprise that the Protestant Revolution and its offshoots occurred in the West. In the Byzantine Empire, those Christians were equally brilliant or even more brilliant, but their philosophical framework was different. And I think that this is an issue that on researchers like yourself should study. Is the Protestant Reformation a consequence of the philosophical framework of the early medieval church?
That is quite possible. So why is it that Protestantism in Europe only had a limited geographic scope? So if you look at a map, essentially Wittenberg, the city where Martin Luther was, most of the spread of Christianity was to the north and northwest, and a little bit to the southwest, into ultimately Switzerland, and so on, but not further than that. On the southeastern front, Protestantism initially made some headway into what today is Austria and Salzburg, so the areas bordering Bavaria. But the Catholic Church managed to fight back on that. And I mean, the emperor at the time came from the Habsburg family, and they explicitly invited the Jesuits, once that order was founded, as also a bulwark to push back against Christianity. And so that was a successful attempt of a counter-reformation. And there is still little work on, say, the Salzburg Protestants, who then had to emigrate or reconvert, and they chose to emigrate, partly into Prussia, actually. And then if we think about Poland, also that in the 16th century had leaned much, much more towards Protestantism, and actually the elite had converted to Protestantism. But also there, the Catholic Church ultimately won back, and that way closed off any further incursion further east. So I think Protestants never even arrived in any strength in the Orthodox world, because they were already stopped on the fringes of the Roman Catholic Empire or sphere of influence. But still, the Orthodox world is so under-researched, and I myself also admittedly don't know much about it, except the very rough observation that a lot of these churches also seem to be nationally bound, like the Greek Orthodox, the Serbian Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, the Ukrainian Orthodox, and so on. And there seems to be a much tighter link between the nation state and or the majority ethnic group and the church, which is quite different from the Roman Catholic Church, with its kind of worldwide approach.
The Greek church, as we established earlier, was highly academic, but the Latin church was able to create that great synthesis between faith and reason. Protestantism is a faith-based movement. It is not as academically rigorous as medieval scholasticism, but the Protestant Revolution could only occur in an environment that encouraged analytical thought. So this is why I would love to see a study showcasing the relationship between the Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Protestant Revolution.
Yeah, I would also love to see that.
So you can do it, Sascha. Yeah, it's like the literature on Ethiopia is actually quite rich, and there's an old journal. It's called Percy. I think it's French, Persee.
Yes, yes,
Oh
yes.
yes. Do you read it?
I have read a few papers as I did literature search, but I don't follow it in a systematic way.
Yeah, it has excellent articles on Africa, especially pre-colonial Africa. Some of the articles are old but still relevant. If you want information on the Asante Empire, that's the place to go to.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you. Yeah,
A very in-depth publication. And then there's that I guess he's retired G.W. Borisok. He has a new book on the relationship between Christianity and Jews in Aksum.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm really interested in Ethiopian intellectual history. There's a book published by Brill I would love to buy, but I'm not going to bore you any further with my with my ruminations on Ethiopia. But seriously, this is something that academics should consider. You should consider the Ethiopian research, and you should ask yourself whether the relationship between Protestantism and education is a selection bias.
Yeah.
No, Sashka, you also did another paper titled Religion in Economic History, a survey. Sashka, what are the studies telling us? Is there a clear link between religion and economic growth?
Let me first say what we did there and what we are now working on, which then will address more closely your question about the link between religion and economic growth. So that survey that we wrote, which came out in a handbook and is roughly a 90 or 100 page piece, at least before it went to print. It was a PDF with 100 pages. We tried to get a sense of, well, what research is out there, written by economists and economic historians, that touches on religion or looks at the role of religion in the economy. And not all of that is directly interested in growth, because some of the questions people have looked into would maybe fall under the label of the economic development. And there is a long debate about, is economic development necessarily economic growth? Or there are lots of topics. There is papers that look at the role of religion in trust, and to the extent that trust is good for growth, it may also have a growth effect. But in any case, that survey chapter tries to just take stock of the existing literature and touches on many different themes. Now, what we then felt when writing this is that every paper is, so to say, one little puzzle piece that links religion to something in the economy. but there isn't really a holistic approach that tries to see, well, how does all of that feed into economic growth? And now I'm getting closer to your question. So what we are trying to do now, same set of authors, Jared Rubin, Ludger Wisman, myself, is that we say, okay, why don't we start from a model of economic growth, a la Solo, where we would have output that is a function of physical capital, human capital, labor, and then total factor productivity, which might also influence economic outcomes. Now, we then say, if we now go back to those same papers that we surveyed earlier on, can we connect them to those elements of a production function? So there is work, and I myself have done some of that, on the role of interest rate restrictions in the Catholic Church, which gave a niche to the Jewish population in Germany to lend at interest, because Christians weren't allowed to lend at interest to each other, but Jews were allowed to lend at interest, and so on. So that whole context of interest rate charging, which may impact on investment and so on, that is something we could probably link to the capital stock. And to the extent that the capital stock is one element in a production function, the findings of that research tell us ultimately also something about growth. Or when we talk about human capital, well, human capital also features in production functions. And to the extent that what we discussed earlier on, Protestantism may foster more education, then that means it also ultimately affects growth. And then labor, we would talk about the size of the workforce. And here we might go back to the gender aspects we discussed. In a country where women stay at home, don't work in the open economy as opposed to a household economy, there would be a smaller labor force than in a country where all women work. So that is then the L in the production function, L for labor, and so on. So we are now thinking, okay, could a growth framework and a production function approach help us to go back to the literature and pull the various pieces together to get an overall view on the role of these various intermediate elements in a production function as driven by religion? So can we thereby enlighten this whole literature on religion and economics and weave it together to form an overall interest into the link between religion and economic growth? So that is ongoing. And yeah, maybe one day I can report back on that.
Well, Sascha, I have some more homework for you. Some time ago, I saw a paper exploring the relationship between communes and religions, and the Amish community is still successful, but most communes tend to fail. So maybe you, Sascha, should do a study explaining why religious communes may be more successful.
Yeah, so on the Amish, I don't know that's the paper you have in mind. James Choi has some fascinating work on that, a former colleague of mine at Warwick, who has a paper on the Amish. I think there are many of these groups. Just these days, again, I was talking with someone about a book that I love, and maybe you know it, by Zellner. And the book is entitled Extraordinary Groups. And it talks about, amongst others, the Amish, but also about gypsies and various other groups that are kind of unusual in the societies where they live. The Amish as a group that still follows a style of life that maybe 200 years ago would have fit perfectly well in the US, but now just seems strange. Similarly, the gypsies who have a lifestyle that doesn't resemble that of Europeans, and so on and so on. So that book is quite fascinating if you haven't read it yet, to look into various of these groups. How do they survive in a society that is so different from them?
And the Amish, I don't know enough about their day-to-day living. Obviously, I've read reports on negative activities in the Amish community, but negative activities are universal. They're not unique to the Amish people. But for the most part, the Amish people seem to be quite confident in their doctrines.
Yes, and yeah, I also find it quite fascinating. And on a visit to the US some years back, I explicitly in Philadelphia went into Amish land to also just see some people on the street and how they live. And yeah, definitely super fascinating. So what that colleague of mine, a former colleague, James Joy, says is that the rules of the church or the religious side of things interact super strongly with family life. So it's ultimately a way to also enforce that the family stays together, because the Amish allow youths who turn 18 to have a year where they can explore the world and then have to decide whether they want to return to the community or leave it. And by having that very explicit option, it also enforces, again, the norms, because those that don't want to comply with those norms, they leave, and the ones that do want to comply with them stay, thereby, again, enforcing the continuity of those norms.
Yes, but in your paper, Sashka, you made a reference to that famous study done by Barra and McCleary. They show a strong element of historical persistence in state religions, in that having a state religion in 1900 predicts having a state religion in 1970 and 2000. And they also argue that beliefs about heaven and the hell affect economic growth.
Yes, yeah, I know that paper. And yeah, so that is the paper that plays with various different aspects of religion, amongst others, church attendance, belief in hell, belief in heaven, where church attendance seems to have a negative effect on growth, but belief in hell and belief in heaven seem to both individually have a positive effect on growth. They also actually look at religious shares. So they have regressions where they throw in the share of Protestants in a country. But when those other variables are in there, church attendance, belief in hell, belief in heaven, the Protestant share is not positive, because it seems it's less about the denomination per se than about people's beliefs that influence growth. But that paper by now is 18 years old.
Yes,
I'm
but
not
it's still
sure
highly
whether anyone
cited.
has. Yeah, absolutely, and it's a great paper, definitely. And they have followed up a bit on that in their book that came out recently. But yeah, I'm not sure anyone has rerun those regressions with data from the last few years.
Benjamin Friedman has a new book on religion and Christianity. I'm yet to read it, but I've been looking at the reviews.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, but religion is such a fascinating topic. It's just like Peter Harrison in his book, The Fall of Man and the Foundation of Science. He posits that Protestantism promoted the inductive method. So they were interested in experimentation, whereas earlier Christians were more deductive. The Protestants wanted to prove that the ideas were actually real. It was a more pragmatic school of thought, and as such Protestantism led to science. It's an interesting thesis, and I read the book online, so you don't have to buy it. I can send you a copy.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but are you interested in the history of science, Sashka?
Say on the passive side, reading papers, yes, but it's not an area I'm actively pursuing myself. Yeah.
you're not actively pursuing. But if you read the books of Peter Harrison, you're going to pursue it, because science is independent of religion, but many scientific frameworks are impacted by religion. So the late Stanley Yaki, a brilliant European academic who lived in America for several years, he's now deceased. He has a book titled Science and Creation, arguing that the outlooks of religion can impact science, a linear progress of time versus uh, what the linear progress of time versus what we call social cycle theories.
Yeah.
But
No,
Sash,
on this whole interaction of science, religion, and progress, I'm a big fan of the work by Roland Benabou, Davide Ticchi, and Andrea Vindini, who have this paper entitled Forbidden
hi,
Fruits.
I know it. I can't pronounce their names, but I know the paper.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I like that whole approach to also see how the church reacts to scientific advances, and by either accommodating them or trying to push them back. And I think over time, the church has accepted more and more things, such as evolution theory and so on, because at some point, it also politically doesn't make sense to say it's all wrong if there is so much scientific evidence to support it. Yeah.
And Jared Rubin has also done brilliant studies on the link between religion and the adoption of technology.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but Sashka, I enjoy having this conversation, but unfortunately, I have to wrap it up. I'm in Jamaica, so it's night, and in Australia, it's the other day. So in Jamaica, it's still Thursday. Yeah, so I have to
Yeah.
wrap it
No,
up.
no.
So
You
bye.
deserve to get some rest.
All right
Thanks
then, bye.
for
Yeah.
the conversation.
All right then, bye, Sashka.
Bye bye.